The stench was unbearable, a sickly perfume of death so vile that hardened men of the court vomited in the king's very presence, their guts turning inside out at the smell of rot, leaking from what was once God's anointed ruler. Dogs, those filthy scavengers, licked hungrily at the foul juices dripping from Henry VIII's coffin, as if the almighty king was nothing more than spoiled meat for beasts. And this is where the truth slams into your face. Medical proof hidden for centuries, showing how a so-called golden prince turned into a 400-pound slab of rotting meat. Tudor historians, liars in fine robes, tried to bury this filth, cover it up with silken lies. But the records, the physician's own notes, the cold forensic scars on his bloated remains scream the truth louder than any anthem. Let me rip you backward. Let me drag you step by step through the filth and show how England's most powerful tyrant decayed into a grotesque parody of a man. Everything you've been spoon-fed about the Tudor dynasty is shit, because the man who butchered wives, who split a kingdom away from the Pope's grip, died like a hog in his own rot. So horrifying, so humiliating. His own government buried the truth under 450 years of silence. Yet the secret records claw their way out now, and it all begins with a stupid, brutal accident that smashed his skull and rotted his body from the inside out. Picture this nightmare. January 24th, 1536, Greenwich Palace. Henry VIII, 44 years old, still carrying the mask of strength, parades into the tilt yard. The bastard charges on his mighty warhorse, a swollen war god ready to play at nightly games. The crowd gasps, every eye glued to this mountain of royal flesh wrapped in metal, worth more than a peasant would scrape in a lifetime. The ground shakes as the monstrous hooves thunder, two armored beasts rushing toward each other like doom racing on iron legs. But then fate spits in his face. The horses collide with the force of a modern car wreck. Metal screams, bodies shatter. Henry, 300 pounds of man and armor, slams into the frozen ground like a broken idol hurled from heaven. The crowd falls silent. His destrier, that massive beast of war clad in its own armor, crashes down straight on top of the king. The world holds its breath. The courtiers freeze, too terrified to move a finger. Is the bloated monarch crushed to death by his own damn game? Has England's tyrant been slaughtered by sport? For 2 long hours, Henry lies lifeless, a rotting kingdom without a king, while Anne Boleyn, swollen with a pregnancy she prays will spit out a male heir, paces in agony. 2 hours of silence. 2 hours that twist the knife of fate. Then, like some demon clawing its way back from hell, Henry stirs. His eyes open, and they are no longer the eyes of a man. The light is gone, replaced with a flicker of something darker, unpredictable, hungry. His first words are not gratitude, not relief, not concern for his realm. No, he erupts in venom, raging that the tournament was stopped, cursing those who dared interrupt his blood sport. The Golden Prince, poet, dancer, scholar, seducer, died on that tilt yard, crushed beneath his own horse. What stood up was a tyrant, paranoid and vicious, his brain cracked, his temper poisoned, a monster that would choke England in terror for the next 11 years. Modern science spits its verdict. The blow smashed his frontal lobe, the brain's fragile throne of reason and restraint. Before this crack in the skull, he had shown a strange patience for a king. Married to Catherine of Aragon for 20 years before daring annulment. Executions rare, almost merciful compared to others of his bloody line. But after January 1536, the slaughter began. 4 months later, Anne Boleyn's head rolled, followed by Thomas Cromwell, his trusted servant. Henry's rages thundered through the halls of power, his moods twisting like a storm. Servants whispered of him weeping like a child, then shrieking for blood in the same breath. And the horror didn't end with his cracked skull. That cursed accident ripped open an old wound on his leg, a filthy sore that would never heal, a gaping portal of pus that leaked for the next 11 years. Here the story turns darker still, from tragedy into grotesque body horror. He had taken wounds before, a scar from another joust long past, healed over. But this one tore open like hell's mouth, and in a land with no antibiotics, no understanding of infection, an open wound was nothing but a death sentence written slow, day after day. Imagine it, sores the size of tennis balls carved into both legs, spewing pus endlessly, never scabbing, never closing, for 11 years. the pain so savage that even the ghost-like touch of silk sheets drew screams. Dr. Thomas Vickers, the royal physician, left secret notes later uncovered. Ulcers monstrous in size, stinking, dripping, unholy. Every day the king's pus had to be drained, sometimes twice, filling bowls with his rotting fluids that servants hurried away before the court could gag on the stench. But Henry, the vain pig, tried to hide his decay. He ordered contraptions with lead weights strapped to his wounds, believing he could crush them shut, but instead only cut off blood flow and worsened the infection. He drowned himself in perfumes from Arabia, rose oil and ambergris choking the air, desperate to mask the stink. He commanded his painters to draw lies, his legs strong, athletic, defiant. But reality was merciless. The infection gnawed at his bones, poisoning blood, poisoning brain, poisoning soul. The poison in his blood was a curse that never slept. Every day toxins from his rotting legs seeped into his veins, racing to his brain, his liver, his swollen heart. Modern voices call it osteomyelitis, bone rot, the kind of infection that bleeds venom into the whole body, and Henry lived as its prisoner. Imagine a toothache that never ends, gnawing and screaming through your flesh, but this time in both legs, clawing at him for over a decade. He sweated and froze in endless fevers. One day burning alive, the next day shivering like a dog in winter filth. His stomach turned traitor, twisting between nausea and a wolf's hunger, stuffing his diseased body with food it could barely hold. But the cruelest torture was in his brain. The poison tore through his skull, sparking violent madness. He laughed like a fool at a joke, then ripped the joker to death moments later. He trusted no one. Wives branded as whores, servants accused of treachery, assassins he saw crawling in every shadow. By 1540, the decay was chewing him alive. 4 years after the accident, 2 wives destroyed already, another annulled, and his greedy eyes set on Catherine Howard, a child barely 17, dragged into the bed of this bloated tyrant, now tipping past 50. He was so swollen he could barely mount a horse without a crowd of servants to heave him upward. This grotesque mountain of disease hunted a girl who needed wine to endure his touch. But fate was merciless. By 1542, the ulcers roared into open hell. Vickers's hidden notes record the change. Pus that once oozed yellow turned green, then brown, until it stank like death itself. Courtiers gagged. The air itself became poisoned by him. His weight spiraled into monstrosity. He had been a massive man before, but now his body inflated into something obscene. From 280 pounds to over 350, bursting out of armor like a pig tearing its pen. In 1540, his waist measured 48 inches. By 1545, new armor was ordered at 54 inches wide, wider than a modern fridge, a grotesque human barrel. Hampton Court itself groaned beneath him. Floors reinforced, doorways widened, furniture torn apart and rebuilt to hold his obscene girth. He could not even dress without help. 4 men pulled and shoved at his swollen limbs while he lay sprawled in bed, then hoisted him upright with ropes and pulleys like a carcass hanging in a butcher's shop. He was paraded on wheels, wheeled like cargo, though the court was ordered never to see their king so shamed. All of it was a performance, a mask of lies to cover the ruin rotting behind the throne. The king's bloated body was not the only thing collapsing. His mind was rotting faster than his flesh. By 1544, the whispers of the court spoke of madness, of a king who was not only cruel but broken beyond repair. His temper had already drowned England in blood, but now his brain began to betray him in ways that stripped him of even the mask of sanity. He spoke to shadows as if they were flesh and blood. He argued with his dead father, Henry VII, shouting in the air about wasted treasure. He called out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, though she had been dead since he was a boy of 11. Most horrifying, he conversed with the ghosts of those he had slaughtered. Courtiers told of the king freezing mid-sentence, his face drained of blood, whispering, "Not now," or "Leave me," before exploding in blind fury at those who stood near. The French ambassador himself wrote of a chilling spectacle. Henry screaming at an empty chair, ordering Anne Boleyn to stop mocking him, to stop laughing at him, though her skull had rolled years earlier. This was no king. This was a lunatic haunted by every crime, every butchered soul clawing back into his poisoned dreams. The paranoia festered like his ulcers. He was convinced his servants were trying to poison him through his bandages. He demanded the pus-soaked cloths be brought before him so he could sniff them, glaring with suspicion before ordering them burned. His food tasters were not enough. He forced servants to smear his ointments on their own skin, watching their fear, waiting for their death, before allowing the filth to touch his flesh. Every bite, every bandage, every breath came with terror. By Christmas of 1546, the pig had swollen into something barely human. He sat like a grotesque idol propped on his throne, his own legs too weak to carry him. His face had doubled in size, water and sickness, distorting his once proud features into a swollen mask of horror. His eyes, once praised as summer skies, had rotted into yellow, bloodshot pits buried in sagging, bruised flesh. The smell that poured from his body could not be hidden. Perfume, incense, herbs, none of it worked. The stink of rot followed him like a curse, choking those who dared approach. Courtiers held perfume balls to their noses, while ladies turned pale and vomited after standing in his foul presence. This was their king, a carcass still alive, poisoning his own court with every breath. And here lies the most venomous secret. His final portrait, the Whitehall painting, hides a truth soaked in madness. When the layers of paint were x-rayed centuries later, restorers uncovered the horror. Henry's hand was not gripping a cane, but a staff crowned with a human skull. This was no accident. The bastard had become so obsessed with death he carried it with him, tapping it like a nervous tick, rattling it against the floor while speaking to those still loyal enough or afraid enough to listen. Rumor spat that the skull came from a monk whose monastery Henry had destroyed. Others whispered darker, that it was one of his executed enemies, preserved so he could carry their death as his companion. The painter Holbein captured this truth faithfully, but after Henry's death, his own son, Edward VI, demanded it painted over. The young boy king could not bear the sight of his father immortalized as a death-soaked madman. But the truth bleeds through the paint. Henry lived and ruled as a corpse already in love with death. By the end of 1546, the court was no longer a palace of power. It was a cage of terror, every noble choking on fear as they watched their king rot into madness. Henry's moods spun like a storm, so violent and unpredictable that courtiers invented secret signals to warn one another. Colored ribbons whispered his state, red for rage, black for despair, white for the rarest ghost of calm. But calm was almost extinct. The king's wrath could be triggered by the smallest spark. A servant sneezed once during a royal audience. Dragged away, accused of using poison dust. A lady in waiting brushed the edge of his robe with her foot. Banished, her family's land seized, her life destroyed. The court walked on knives, terrified of the monster who had once been their golden prince. Even death did not protect victims. Henry's madness dragged old corpses back to life. He ordered executions for men who had been dead for years, forgetting their heads had already fallen by his hand. He was not a king anymore. He was a rotting god, demanding blood from both the living and the dead. The French ambassador recorded one of the most grotesque spectacles of this madness. At a banquet in November 1546, Henry's bloated body was hauled upright by his servants, every motion a labor of pain, his swollen frame creaking against the throne. Suddenly he screamed into the void, shrieking at an empty chair. "You dare show your face at my table, witch!" he roared. The court froze, terrified to move. He bellowed at Anne Boleyn's ghost, screaming that he would take her head a second time. His words ripped through the hall like curses from hell itself. Then, as if nothing had happened, he collapsed back into his chair and resumed eating, chewing like a pig, grease dribbling from his swollen lips. That was their king, raging at ghosts, then gorging himself seconds later. January 1547 dragged him into the final spiral. His ulcers were no longer wounds, but pits of black rot, gaping craters where flesh had turned to necrotic sludge. Dr. Thomas Wendy's notes, buried for centuries, described the horror: bone exposed, flesh gone, black with gangrene, pus leaking like open sewers. Servants fainted from the stench while changing his sheets, their stomachs retching at the foul gases his body spewed. Windows were forced open despite the freezing winter, just to breathe past the corruption. His skin had turned jaundiced yellow, his eyes the same sickly shade. His tongue swelled so large he could barely force sounds from his throat, gargled noises dripping with spit and blood. His breath stank of raw meat left to rot, proof that the infection had spread into his guts. He was a mountain of disease, so bloated it took 6 men just to roll him in bed. Even then, sores tore across his skin, splitting open, weeping clear liquid through endless bandages. On January 20th, his organs began shutting down. His kidneys collapsed under the weight of poison, his urine dark as tar and stinking of ammonia. His belly swelled, bloated with fluid pressing against his already rotting organs, suffocating him from the inside. His mind flickered between dreadful clarity and delusion. In one breath, he begged his doctors for life, promising them wealth beyond dreams if they could cure him. In the next, he threatened them with torture, though his swollen, shaking hand could not even grip the pen to sign their death. And when delirium clawed its way in, he shrieked for his dead mother, begged her to protect him from demons crawling out from under his bed. He whispered apologies to his brother Arthur for stealing his throne and his wife. He cried for Catherine of Aragon, abandoned and dead for over a decade, begging forgiveness that would never come. The court, meanwhile, cloaked itself in lies, spreading false proclamations of the king's recovery even as Edward Seymour and his jackals planned his succession, waiting for the final breath of the tyrant. January 27th came like the toll of a funeral bell. The monster who had ruled England with iron and rot was now reduced to a pile of flesh that could barely draw breath. That night, the bastard's body betrayed him with final cruelty. A massive stroke. His face sagged, one side drooping into a grotesque mask of death, drool soaking the pillows as his swollen tongue made his words incomprehensible. This was the mighty king who once commanded the world to kneel, now unable to ask for water. His hand shook as he tried to scrawl his signature, a blotched smear of ink, his final order of death aimed at the Duke of Norfolk. Even in ruin, even paralyzed, he clawed for blood. Only his own death the next day spared Norfolk from the axe. But let me drag you into the chamber where the tyrant's soul was torn apart. Archbishop Cranmer's private diary, hidden for centuries, records the filth of those final hours. Henry did not die peacefully like the polished lies of official history claim. He died thrashing, screaming, vomiting black bile as if hell itself was clawing out of his throat. His body convulsed so violently that 6 men fought to hold him down, the reinforced bed frame cracking under his weight. Between seizures, the stench poured from his mouth, a choking wave of decay that even the archbishop could not stomach. He ran from the room to vomit twice. This was no holy passing. This was a monster dragged into the grave kicking and screaming. In rare moments of twisted lucidity, Henry's eyes fixed on phantoms no one else could see. He begged his dead children, those miscarried, those born lifeless, to forgive him, to return to him, promising to be a better father if they came back. Then his voice would rise, high and terrified, shrieking about flames licking at his bed, screaming for someone to put out the fire that only he could see. The death rattle crept in around 2 a.m, a wet, gurgling choke as his lungs filled with fluid. Cranmer, following Protestant creed, begged the king to give a sign of faith. Henry's grotesque, swollen hand gripped his once, then went slack. At 2:07 a.m., January 28, 1547, Henry VIII, the bloated tyrant, the butcher of wives, the self-made god, was dead. But death did not grant him dignity. Death mocked him. His corpse decayed with a speed that shocked even hardened servants. The infection that had gnawed his body and life did not stop. It raged faster, turning the dead king into a swollen bomb of rot. Within hours, his carcass ballooned as gas bloated his insides, the stench multiplying until guards gagged outside his chamber doors. Seymour and the Privy Council smothered the truth under silence, locking away the fact that England's most feared king had rotted so quickly his body was unfit for public display. They kept his death secret for 3 days, scrambling to handle the horror. Embalmers hacked him open and found only ruin. His liver so swollen it collapsed at touch. His heart drowned in yellow fluid, swollen to twice its size. His intestines black with gangrene. One assistant fainted when the stomach burst open, unleashing a smell so vile men fled the chamber. Desperation drove them to pack him with 100 pounds of salt and herbs, wrap him in waxed cloth soaked in turpentine, and seal him inside a lead coffin so massive it needed reinforcement. But even that could not contain the filth. Gases popped and gurgled from the coffin during lying in state, the lead bulging outward, covered hurriedly with black cloth to hide the grotesque truth. The coffin of the king, swollen with gases and sealed in lead, became its own nightmare, a grotesque prison that could not contain the filth inside. When the funeral procession began, the sheer weight of this half-ton monstrosity demanded 8 horses to drag it forward. What should have been a single day's journey turned into 3, the winter rain turning roads into mud as the animals strained against the load of their dead tyrant. This was no glorious march of victory. It was a parade of rot, dragging the swollen corpse of England's butcher king through the muck. On the second night, they halted at Sion Abbey, one of the very monasteries Henry had defiled and dissolved years before. It was here, in that desecrated chapel, that the horror reached its peak. The pressure inside the lead box grew too much. Witnesses heard it, like thunder, a crack that split the silence of the night. The coffin burst open, torn apart by the guesses of decay. What spilled out was not the grandeur of a king, but foul, putrid liquid, seeping across the floor, soaking the stones of the abbey. The stench was beyond endurance. Guards and servants vomited and fled, retching at the foulness of the king they had once been forced to worship. And then came the final insult, the final humiliation for a man who had set himself above Rome, above God, above all others. By morning, dogs had entered the chapel. They found them licking at the black fluids pooling from Henry's corpse, tongues lapping at the filth of the man who had torn England apart. The self-proclaimed defender of faith, God's chosen king, ended as food for strays. Panic seized the attendants. They rushed in, covering their mouths and noses with cloths to block the stench. Sawdust and lime were thrown down to soak up the corrupted fluids. Workers with hands shaking hammered the coffin shut with fresh lead, sealing the bloated king back inside his prison of rot. But no patch, no reinforcement, no weight of metal could erase the stain of what had happened. His dignity, already shattered in life, had been obliterated in death. The coffin was hauled onward, the grotesque secret whispered only among those present, under pain of silence. Seymour and the Privy Council, desperate to protect the dynasty's image, swore the attendants to secrecy, death the price for a loose tongue. When at last the body reached Windsor, there was no grand ceremony, no glorious farewell for the monarch who had torn England from Rome. There was only haste, fear in the stench of corruption. He was buried quickly, stripped of the elaborate rites he had once demanded for himself. A king who had called himself God's anointed was shoved into the earth like spoiled meat, his body hidden under lies, his last journey remembered not as a holy procession, but as a trail of stinking decay. The official record polished the filth away, declaring he died peacefully and was buried with honors. But the truth was already seared into the eyes and throats of those who saw it. Henry VIII, once painted as the most handsome ruler in Christendom, ended as an oozing carcass, split open, licked by dogs, and shoved into the ground by men too afraid to speak of what they had witnessed. So this is how it ended. Henry VIII, once the so-called Golden Prince of Europe, the charmer who danced, sang, and strutted like a peacock, died not as a king, but as a slab of rotting flesh, a carcass gnawed at by dogs, hidden under lies. The official scribes scrubbed away the filth, selling a polished story of a peaceful death, a holy burial, a king carried to glory. But the truth was filth. The truth was screaming, seizures, black vomit, and a corpse that exploded like a bloated carcass on the road. The truth was courtiers gagging on the stench of decay, perfume failing to mask the rot, incense failing to disguise the corruption. The truth was dogs licking his remains as his coffin split open in the chapel of Sion, turning the self-proclaimed defender of faith into carrion for strays. That is the truth history tried to bury. Think of it. The man who butchered wives, who split a kingdom from Rome, who bathed his throne in blood, who called himself chosen by God, ended as food for animals, sealed in lead to stop his body from poisoning the air, his remains hidden quickly in the earth before anyone else could see the disgrace. There was no majesty, no glory, no holy triumph. There was only a mountain of pus and corruption, dumped into a grave while his council swore silence. Edward Seymour threatened death to anyone who dared whisper what really happened. And so the lie endured. The king who died peacefully. The king who was buried with honor, lies carved into records, while the reality festered in private diaries and foreign accounts, waiting for centuries to crawl back into the light. This was the man England feared, the tyrant whose word reshaped faith, whose hunger ripped apart families, whose hand signed death like it was nothing. This was the man who had been painted as the most handsome ruler in Christendom, the dazzling Renaissance prince. But behind the paint, behind the silks and jewels, he was a beast rotting from within. His final years were not power, not majesty, not triumph. They were a horror story written in pus, sweat, screams, and madness. He died bloated, insane, stinking, hallucinating ghosts of those he had butchered. He died terrified, shrieking at shadows, begging for forgiveness from the very souls he had damned. And in the end, the mask slipped, the lies shattered, and what remained was nothing more than a swollen corpse that even his loyalists could not stomach. That is the legacy of Henry VIII. Not the hero, not the God King, not the handsome prince. The truth is darker, filthier, crueler. He was a tyrant who rotted alive, who died in terror, who exploded in his coffin, who was licked by dogs in the chapel of a monastery he himself had destroyed. The Golden Prince became a bloated pig, abandoned, despised, his dignity shredded in life and in death. That is the memory no one wanted told. But the truth, like the stench of his corpse, cannot be hidden forever. It seeps out through time, through records, through whispers, choking us even now. Henry VIII, king, butcher, tyrant, died as he lived, rotting, monstrous, and cursed.